Good morning, good morning, good morning, good morning. Glad to see everybody back again. We do have a big crowd, so I know you're squeezed in, which is great, I have to say. It's always delightful to see over 200 people at our breakfast meeting on the day before a 3-day weekend. So we were concerned about this date. Clearly not. And I credit that to having such a wonderful, fantastic speaker with us. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Ambassador Ron Neumann and his wife, Elaine, who is here, who have traveled all the way out from Washington, having traveled for many decades all over the world. And what Ron will be sharing with us today is his insights on the situation in Afghanistan, which, if anybody listened to the news this morning, you will know it's changing minute by minute. So with that, Ron has an esteemed background. He'll give you a little flavor of his insight. If you haven't read the announcement, his bio was there. But if you really want to understand more about diplomacy in the world, about Ron's and Elaine's experience in 37 years in the Foreign Service, I highly recommend that you come up and buy a copy of his book. It is fabulous stories of many places around the world. So you can get that after the presentation. But for now, Ron, would you give us an introduction about what's going on in Afghanistan?
As Maureen said, my family's experience of Afghanistan is somewhat unusual because my father was ambassador to Afghanistan from 66 to 73, which makes us one of only 3 father-sons to have run the same embassy in our diplomatic experience. It has absolutely no political significance, proves you can do it once every 100 years. But he went there at 67, and that same year I finished graduate school. I had a 3.5-month break before I had to report for the U.S. Army. And so my wife Elaine and I went to Afghanistan, and in those peaceful days we traveled all over the country. So we had an experience of Afghanistan that very few people get nowadays. Traveled all the way through the center of the country by Jeep. I went with a hunting party up into the far northeast by Jeep, and then a horse, and then yak, and it was quite a time. My father and I were very close professionally as well as familially, and so we used to talk about Afghanistan. Not all the time, I grant you, but I was following things. So then I went there as ambassador from 2005 to 7. And then since I continued to speak and write about Afghanistan, I've sometimes said it's a little like malaria. It's not good for you, but it gets in the blood. So I go back once a year. I started going back in 2010 because it's not very seemly to show up right when your successor's just gotten there. So I waited a couple of years. And then I started going back in 2010. I think I've been back every year since, at least once, some years, more than once, a couple of years on some special study projects. I was there in November, and I will be back again, God willing, the creeks don't rise, in October for another visit. Afghanistan, it is necessary because Afghanistan is a really complicated place. And, of course, after 18 years, people have their minds kind of made up. And because it's complicated, if you have a very strong view, you can go to Afghanistan and you can treat it pretty much like going to the shopping market. If you decided what your dinner is for the night, you can get the pieces that fit your menu. You can come back and you can write the account that said, I was there and this is the way it is. If your views are 180 degrees out, you can do exactly the same thing. In fact, I think it was pretty well summed up by a friend of mine, former Afghan minister, said he was once asked, can you explain Afghanistan in 1 or 2 words? And he said, yeah, 1 word, good. 2 words, not good. And so when you've got your hands mentally wrapped around that, you're ready. So what I want to do, and we don't have a lot of time, and I do want to leave time for questions. I know people always say that, and then they don't, but I will. I want to get rid of a couple of misconceptions, which do not tell you whether you should be there or should not be, but you just need to get out of them. I want to very briefly make the case for staying, recognizing that I've been involved in this as a policy maker as well as an observer. I'm interested, not disinterested, and you have to take that into account. And then what I want to do is I want to very quickly sort of go through what President Trump announced as our policy and what the evolution of that policy has been, because it really, some pieces aren't working and some pieces have changed, and use that as a framework to give you a very broad overview of what is going on. The two things I would like to get people to get out of their head, this is going to be hard, but one is a phrase that I'm sure you all know. Some of you are probably going to ask me a question about it. You've been there, you've been trying this for 18 years, why don't you know it won't work? With respect, there is no one thing we have been trying for 18 years. By my count, we have had 9 separate policies in Afghanistan in 18 years. 2 under Bush administration, 5 under the Obama administration, which I think wasted a lot of time, and I think we now have 2 under Trump. Our problem is not that we can't get this right in 18 years. Our problem is we can't do any one thing for 3 years. That may be such a serious problem that it has to be taken into account when you think about the future, but it is a different problem. And the other is kind of corollary. It's particularly on the military side. You know, you tried to build this and it didn't work. And I think people need to understand just how that policy went down, because the decision to enlarge the Afghan military made in 2009 really resourced in 2010 with the money deployment of our surge troops. By 2013, we were already starting to withdraw. Conceptually, you're going to double the size of an army in an almost illiterate country, and you're going to do it in about 3 years. Our troop deployment to Afghanistan looks like a slightly flattened roller coaster. You've got a very steep rise and a rather flat period for about 3 years, and you're already coming down. In that period, we put in a lot of money and a lot of equipment, and we completely under-resourced it in terms of time and personnel. Time, because you can't just do this kind of stuff quickly. Personnel, because NATO defined what the requirement was for training teams. We never, with the exception of 1 year, we never got over 50% of the training teams that were deemed required for the effort. And by 2014, we no longer had teams even to the corps level at every corps, and we did not have any teams permanently assigned below the corps level. And we stopped air cover. We trained the Afghans to fight with us the way we fight, calling on air support when you need it. And in 2014, although we had not really gotten very far in the development of the Air Force, we said, and this is a line, direct quote from the NSC, we are no longer at war with the Taliban. So we are no longer going to provide air support. We will only bomb what we call an extremis, like in a city is falling, or if we're under attack. Taliban didn't quite know the war was over, so they could still attack us. And that went on until the end of 2016, when President Obama reversed 2 major elements of the policy. He left the last 8,000 troops in place that he was going to pull out. He took off the air restriction because we were losing the war. That was the situation that President Trump inherited. And I don't blame President Trump for not being too keen with what he inherited. Actually, President Obama wasn't too keen when he inherited it. So President Trump did a lot of thinking. He would have liked to go home. It's one of the oddities of Afghanistan that there is a basic similarity in one sense between President Obama and President Trump, 2 totally, as you know, dissimilar people. Each of them would like now to get out of Afghanistan, and neither one wanted to be responsible for a mess. I don't know whether that will continue to deter President Trump, but it has so far. So, the policy President Trump enunciated in the middle of 2017 was that we would take off the time limit. President Obama kept putting time limits on the policy when the things were supposed to end, which was generally deemed to be a mistake. President Trump said, I'm taking off the time limits. Although, Afghans are going to have to perform. This is not a blank check forever. He said, we are going to make a renewed effort to build the Afghan army, security forces. To that end, we increased the number of trainers, and we did something we have not done since before Vietnam. We moved the training mission back out of the reserves and into the regular forces. The notion, although he was not very explicit about it, being, let's see if we can't get the Afghan army to the point where we could pretty much back off the fighting end and let them have that. New effort at the economy, although not a big one because we were cutting aid. We continued to cut aid. An effort, as he said, to put this in a regional context, including a great deal of increased pressure on Pakistan, seeking the help of other regional states, and then what people call a cross-cutting thread of trying to get going with peace negotiations with the Taliban. So you had a change in the time limit, a changed emphasis in the military portion, some economic effort, an effort at a regional strategy, and this cross-cutting negotiations piece. Well, where most of the press is, and therefore I take that first, I would say the military piece is not going as well as we would hope, as I hoped. There are a lot of reasons for this. It's not uniformly bad. Commandos are performing very well, although they're being overused. Some of the other aspects, the Air Force is getting better. It's beginning actually to take on some close air support missions. So this is not uniform, but they have lost ground. They have, of course, the classic problem in an insurgency that defenders have to secure the population, secure a great deal of area, and the attackers get to decide where they want to mass and attack, and they're not terribly interested necessarily in holding ground. But overall, I have to say that the military effort has not gone as well as I would have hoped. And I was much more enthusiastic when I visited in 2017. By 2018, I was not as enthusiastic about where we were going to get to. If you want to get a bottom line for the military piece, I would use a sort of what sounds like a contradictory phrase. It's a declining stalemate. It's not losing, because losing means you get to a point where you have lost. Particularly as long as we are there, as long as you have the air support that we now have for the Afghans, we will not lose, and they will not lose. But they have lost more ground. They have lost more areas, rural areas, to Taliban control. So you have a declining security picture, but it's declining, but still within the context of stalemate. It's not declining to loss. So it's a kind of oxymoronic phrase, but it's the best I could do to characterize the situation without over-characterizing it. The economic piece, there is some success. Tax collection is better. They're making IMF targets, but overall, there are a lot more reasons for people to take their money out of Afghanistan than put it in, and so you have a major problem with unemployment. And a lot of things you could say about that. It's not all bad. Afghanistan is not a permanent basket case. It has gas, it has oil, it has coal, iron, semi-precious stones, rare earth. In peace, there is a lot that could be developed. Whether it can be developed in a war is different. The regional piece is not working very well. Both Iran and Russia have picked up increased their relations with the Taliban. And the basic reason for that is that the Islamic State has now also embedded itself in Afghanistan. So if you had a problem at the beginning of the war with worrying about Al-Qaeda being there, having attacked us in New York and killed 3,000 Americans, you now have to deal with the fact that you still have the remnants of Al-Qaeda there working with the Taliban, and you now have the Islamic State. And you also have about a half a dozen other, more than a dozen other smaller terrorist organizations, Islamic movement of Uzbekistan and a movement of Tajikistan. Afghanistan has the potential for being a base for instability for most of Central Asia if it is not controlled. In any event, because of great doubts about our willingness to persevere, the Iranians have decided that they have to warm up their ties with the Taliban out of fear of the Islamic State. This is a very unnatural relationship for Iran. Taliban killed Iranian diplomats during the earlier period, but with Iran, it is strictly a transactional matter. Taliban is less dangerous to them than the Islamic State, and the two are hostile to each other, therefore they warm up relations with the Taliban. The Russians are even more conspiratorial because they certainly have the fear of the Islamic State, and they have the same motivation for beginning relations with the Taliban, and they're perfectly upfront about it. Even 2.5 years ago, I was in Herat at a conference. There were some senior out-of-office, theoretically, Russians. They were quite open about their relations with the Taliban. They claim no weapons. They claim it's political. They also have a strange theory. Now, you have to hold on to your chair a little bit here, because the Russians argue that we, the United States, have helped establish the Islamic State in northern Afghanistan as payback for the Russians coming into Syria. I think you have to be a Russian to come up with that one. But in any event, I don't know if they believe it 100%. They act like they believe it. They've said it now repeatedly for over 2 years. If they didn't believe it at the beginning, they may have talked themselves into it by now. But the fact is, whether they fully believe it or not, they have increased their relations with the Taliban. So we are not getting the regional peace we want. And the main reason we're not getting it is that there is a lack of confidence about what we will do in Afghanistan. And that is particularly the case with Pakistan. Pakistan, which gives shelter to the Taliban. Pakistan has never believed that we would stick with the Afghan project. That's interesting because that's also the view that Osama bin Laden wrote in some of the stuff which has been declassified and found on his computers after the Abbottabad raid. One of the things he wrote was that he wanted to draw the Americans into Afghanistan because they would not have the patience to stick it, and they would be defeated following the defeat of the Soviet Union, and this would show that God's hand really was with the Mujahideen. That is a problem we still have to worry about, because if you prove to a lot of fanatics that God is on their side, they're probably good for the long haul. That's one of those things where I would argue it's a very big reason to remain in Afghanistan, but it's very hard to give it texture, to people who don't really want to think about that. In any event, the Pakistanis have never believed we would stay. I remember General Kayani, Chief of Staff, Pakistani Army, twice removed, saying to General Allen, I think you're going to leave prematurely, you're going to leave a mess on my doorstep, and I'm going to have to clean it up. That is still a Pakistani view. And they are neuralgic to the point of paranoid about the Indians, although one has to always remember even paranoids have real enemies. But they are very paranoid about the Indians. And they are worried that they will have all kinds of troubles from Afghanistan. For them, the Taliban, at least the Taliban at war, provide a certain assurance that hostile forces to them cannot go into Pakistan. So Pakistanis do give some help to the peace of peace negotiations. Their line is that their influence is sufficient to bring the Taliban to the table, but it is not sufficient to make them do anything. One could perhaps question this, but in any event, That's their line. So our regional policy piece has moved from putting maximum pressure on Pakistan to, okay, we're not giving them the money, but please, would you guys help out? This is not quite the maximum pressure announced by President Trump about a year ago. So that piece has evolved as well. And the biggest piece, of course, is the very urgent effort to find a peace negotiation, which is being led by Ambassador Khalilzad. That is the most energetic part. It is the biggest change in our policy because we are signaling in all kinds of ways that we really would like to get this wound up. So from having a policy announcement a year ago that we're not putting timelines on this to a sense that couldn't we finish this thing by 2020, you have a that I would submit that is a change in policy. Now, what is happening in these negotiations? And I have to, a brief moment of clarity here. I'm not in them. And Ambassador Khalilzad has never, as far as I know, in his entire professional career, even fully informed his superiors what he was doing at any particular moment. So I have no reason to believe that I'm fully informed. But I think, he has said certain things. There are certain things we know. He is negotiating about two subjects. One is a timeline for withdrawal of U.S. forces, and the other is on the question of counterterrorism. What kinds of guarantees he is getting on any of those subjects, I have no idea whether he is getting any. He is not negotiating an Afghan peace. He is taking the line and correct, that has to be negotiated between Afghans. Taliban is not interested in speaking to the Afghan government, which they regard as our puppet, and they say they only want to negotiate with us. Now, if you want a real peace, and not just a decent interval while we bolt before the Taliban win the war, then that peace has to be made between Afghans. Americans cannot make a peace for Afghans. The line which Ambassador Khalilzad uses is that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. That's a great line, except it's subject to multiple meanings. So it can mean that we won't begin withdrawal until the Taliban give us a paper promise that they'll start negotiations, which could be meaningless. It could mean that we will start negotiations once they are actively engaged at some point in negotiations, but with no guarantee of how they come out. Or it could mean that we will begin withdrawal once there is a real peace negotiated between Afghans. You can drive a truck between the differences of interpretation. I don't know what they mean. Afghans don't know what they mean. Afghan government under President Ghani, which is a weak government, is really scared that we'll bolt on them. And then to make things much more complicated, in case you thought this was getting too simple, you have an Afghan presidential election now scheduled for September. So you have major Afghan political figures that are negotiating, in a sense, or playing on two fields at the same time. So one game is the pre-election campaigning, posturing for the election if it happens. The other is maneuvering to see that they would somehow have a piece of power if the negotiations lead to some transitional government or other form of power structure. So they're trying to play in two different games, two different playing fields at the same time. And so this causes also a lot of friction within the Afghan camp. President Ghani wants to completely control any negotiation as the Afghan state. Makes sense, except that he probably can't really bring about a negotiation that includes all the other political factors in Afghanistan without taking them into his tent. Ghani is brilliant, but he's also a micromanager with a huge temper problem, which he doesn't admit. I remember saying to him just before the election in 2014, I asked him, Ashraf, how are you going to handle the temper problem? And he said, I don't have a temper problem. He has a little problem getting along with folk. So you have Afghans looking for separate ways to negotiate with the Taliban. So it is extraordinarily fluid. And right now it doesn't have a bottom line. I think there are two things that I think one can say. I do not believe that we have a decision to leave at a particular point. I think what you have in the White House, as I've talked to people in the NSC and I've talked to some in the White House, President Trump, I think, would really like to have the war over by 2020. He'd like to be able to campaign on that. And he really does not want a mess. He doesn't want a bad agreement. I don't think we have a decision, a way of reconciling those 2 points. So I think what Khalilzad is doing is trying to reach a satisfactory conclusion within the tension between these 2 poles. But it is not a specific strategy, and knowing Zal, he's very much tactical and not a strategic player anyway, and that is the way he would normally operate. The second thing where I think one has to understand is if you want to negotiate successfully in an insurgency, you have to negotiate and fight at the same time. A lot of Americans instinctively, without thinking about it, treat negotiations and fighting as alternatives. You'll hear people say, we have to stop the fighting so we can negotiate. That is, by the way, it sounds wonderful, it is utter nonsense. You think about major conflicts that have been stopped and frozen, Cyprus, Lebanon, Arab-Israeli, you don't get anywhere. In fact, when you freeze the fighting, what you do is make it possible for the weaker side, particularly, to refuse concessions because they're no longer under the same pressure, which is something the Taliban know, and one reason they're not terribly interested in a ceasefire. And the battlefield geometry is how you leverage negotiations. So if negotiations, the more serious negotiations get, the harder the fighting will probably become, and one should expect that. That's how you put pressure on the other side to make concessions. It's not by toothless gumming around the table. It's on the battlefield. And so you're seeing that now. And this is not a new phenomenon. It's not unique to Afghanistan. Late Israeli Prime Minister Rabin was once asked how you can negotiate with terrorists, and he said, I have to negotiate as though there is no terrorism, and I have to fight terrorism as though there are no negotiations. You have to do both without letting either one take the other hostage. So that's where we are right now. A situation, a military situation. There is, by the way, a good deal more pushback. For some reason, this doesn't get reported in the press. Maybe we don't want it, I don't know. I see security briefings from one of the security firms in Afghanistan. My impression is we've been making a lot of raids with the Afghan forces to keep Taliban from consolidating and being able to attack a city the way they did with Ghazni or Kunduz. Whether that will be successful, I don't know. It isn't all just Taliban raids and everybody sitting on their tail waiting to be attacked. But the overall situation is not great. Peace negotiations are very fluid. Enormous doubt about American policy and about America's purpose. And, you know, that may be great negotiations in real estate, but it's not real cool in the middle of a war. But we are still there. As far as a last point that usually comes up in questions, could you sustain this? Now, the question of whether you want to sustain it is one thing. I would submit that we will have, that yes, there are other places with al-Qaeda in the world, but this is where the attack on us from in New York originated. This is where we will prove that we lost and they won. If we give it up, I think that will harm us. I think the Islamic State is there. I think you will give them space to rebuild. Others will disagree with that, but that's the argument about the danger to the nation. The question is, can you sustain it even if you agree with that? And people, particularly New York Times, tends to look backward and say this cost $1 trillion and we've lost 2,600 people dead, and you can't sustain that. And that, of course, is quite correct, except it's irrelevant. Last year, we lost 12 people in Afghanistan. Afghans lost a lot. They're doing most of the fighting. We lost 12. We lost 80 in non-combat training incidents outside of Afghanistan. We're spending about $15 billion to maintain Afghan forces and ours, and we can, if the training effort doesn't really work and what you're trying to do is maintain the military side of the fight, but not as big a training effort, you could probably scale that down, and I think we got too big a civilian presence there. So you could reduce that. That's a lot of money. It's also about 2% of the defense budget. So a tenth of what you lose in training casualties and 2% of the defense budget is a sustainable figure if we choose to sustain it. It's not say we can, should, or it's just that that's a question of political will. It is not an issue of this is completely impossible. And as far as the mood in Congress goes, it isn't a big issue. And the mood in Congress goes up and down. I remember in Iraq, the last 2 years of major forces in Iraq, we had 100,000 troops in Iraq, and you hardly had a major story in an American paper because we weren't getting a lot of people killed. And then we took everybody out, and then you had the Islamic State break out in the fall of Mosul, and then it was sort of, oh my God, we can't let that happen in Afghanistan. So it's a dynamic, it's not static. So anyway, that's where we are. We have a policy. Administration is still committed to not letting Afghanistan fall and not letting it become, again, a base for terrorism. The military piece is working in some respects, but overall not as far as I would have liked. The politics are incredibly messy. There is a negotiation going on. A lot of what happens in that negotiation will depend on how each side reads the other, and particularly how they read our consistency and firmness of purpose at a time when somebody joked we live under the tweet of Damocles. That's sometimes a little difficult. By the way, I didn't make that up. It's not my line, but it was it was too good to leave lying around. So it is a wide open. I can't give you a clear bottom line, and anybody who does give you a clear bottom line, it's this way or it's that way, absolutely 100%. I suggest you ignore them. So thank you, and I'm open to questions. Okay.
We're going to jump right back into the past and ask you two questions that I'm sure you can give a succinct answer to.
That's a hint. Yeah.
The first one is, these are students of literature and history here, okay? So,
those are dangerous people.
Harold Macmillan, first rule of foreign policy, don't invade Afghanistan. Second question that goes along with that is...
That's not a question, it's a statement.
It's a statement. What do you think about, or did we just not read that book before we went in? And the second one related to it is, are we still fighting Charlie Wilson's war?
Yes, no, and maybe. No. Afghanistan has often been called the graveyard of history. I think it should probably be called a graveyard of illusions and allusions, because I actually think this is kind of meaningless. One of the reasons we went in with a very light footprint and not doing stabilization in the first couple of years, when we probably could have done a lot more, was this assumption that there is a xenophobic reaction in Afghanistan of foreigners. And frankly, it was just wrong. We were greeted very broadly. People were very happy to have us there. We never really took that into account. And there were huge differences also. The British went in as a colonial power. We didn't. We went in at a time when the Afghans themselves were bitterly unhappy with years of warfare and were hoping that seeing this as their last chance for a bright future. I would say you have a gamut of opinion in Afghanistan, and there are a lot of reasons that people who came went to their villages after the defeat of the Taliban, then went back to war. I think there was a lot of mistakes made by the Afghan government, even more than by us. But we are still broadly welcome in Afghanistan. It's ebbing. You can't fight in somebody's backyard for 17 years and not aggravate some people. But I can contrast it with the mood in Iraq. I served in Iraq from February of 2004 to June 2005. A lot of Iraqis thought they needed us in Iraq at that period, but they didn't like it. you could sense that even Iraqis who felt it was essential to have us there, to work with us, really didn't want us there. It's a very different mood from Afghanistan. The other piece of that was?
Charlie Wilson's war.
No. Charlie Wilson's war was, we were giving weapons to anybody who would kill Soviets, kill Russians. That's what it was about. There was good reason for that. But it was with no attention to the internal political developments at all. Our ability to do everything we would like, or even ought to like, in Afghanistan in terms of internal politics is limited, but it is certainly not Charlie Wilson's war, which was virtually tone deaf and brain dead about what we might be building politically. It was also done through the enormous control of the Pakistanis, which they don't have that same. They have control of the Taliban now, but not of us.
Excellent. Thank you. So I'm going to go into a set of questions that are that come under the rubric, why don't we just leave? Okay. So the first is touching on the fact that our original mission, and as you said, we've had, I don't know, what did you say, 8 policies and nine policies in 18 years.
We do one every 2 years.
Yeah. Okay. So once upon a time, the policy was find and kill Osama bin Laden. We did that. Why are we still there? And if we were to leave, let's just say we flip a switch, we walk out tomorrow, what do you see as the ramifications right now for what would happen if we walked out precipitously?
That's all?
That's it. In 2 minutes, because I got a whole bunch more here.
Okay. Now remember, okay, first of all, it was not the full mission. The full mission was destroy Al-Qaeda. We have not destroyed Al-Qaeda. We have seriously hampered it, and we've chased it around, which has probably kept it from doing some of its long-term planning. But we have not destroyed the organization. In fact, their ability to rebuild, we saw that a year or two ago. We suddenly found a rather large Al-Qaeda base that had been established, and it was there for about 6 months before we found it, which does not give you a warm and fuzzy feeling about the total comprehensive quality of our intelligence at all times. So what will happen if we walk out? If we just walk out right away, you will probably have a return to civil war. In fact, even the Taliban worries about that. They don't really want us just to bolt. They want a negotiated process, because even they are worried about a return to a civil war. And to some extent, we use that argument to suggest they should make some more concessions. But when your strongest argument is you should make concessions in case you win, that's a limited argument. But assuming that we and the Taliban, who share an analysis, are correct, then if you go back to civil war, you will open Afghanistan up to a secure base area for the Taliban to reestablish itself. You will open it up to a secure base area, or a fairly secure base area, for the Islamic State to rebuild. So far, the Islamic State in Afghanistan is primarily Afghans. It's an alternate pole for the most radical to go to who don't like Taliban. It's a limited number of foreign fighters, but it's not yet a great pull for Syrians and Iraqis, but it could become so. And you have these various other Islamic jihadist independence movements that would like to project more strongly into Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, other parts of Central Asia, Pakistan itself, China. So you have the potential for a great deal of instability all coming out of Afghanistan. That's something that worries the Chinese as well. Will it all happen? I don't know. People will say, well, the dominoes didn't fall in Vietnam, and it's a true statement, but it doesn't prove much. But you asked me, what do I think will happen? That's what I think will happen in the short run.
Excellent. Well, not a rosy picture, but thank you for being candid. Let's talk more about the Taliban, because you concentrated a bit on the current negotiations that are going on with the Taliban. What is the Taliban? Is there a hierarchical structure inside of the organization that actually can conduct negotiations that can be implemented? And when you mentioned ISIS, getting a stronghold, and the Taliban and ISIS aren't on the same page. Can we do what Iran's doing and pit one against the other? Is there an advantage to us to having the Taliban and ISIS at war with each other, or is that a disadvantage to us? And of course, the Taliban is Sunnis, so why does Iran want to work with them? So all that rolled up into one.
Taliban is Sunni. Iran wants to work with them because ISIS is a much greater danger to Iran than the Taliban. That's very simple. Is there some advantage to us when they fight each other? Yes. Does that advantage go far enough that you want to subcontract the fight with ISIS to people that are still allied with al-Qaeda? I don't think so. But that's what you're doing if you try to play that game, besides which frankly, our ability to play that kind of game, managing, fine-tuning, is really poor. You know, we're an elephant. We do big force. You know, if the elephant dances, it's remarkable, but you don't expect ballet. On the question of the Taliban is quite united, but there are some questions about whether they can hold that unity in a compromised peace. So you see they're unified in the fact that they change out their shadow governors. They have a code of conduct that is more or less implemented. They carry out quasi-state structures in part of the country, running courts. There's a whole study about how Taliban shadow governance is functioning in some parts of Afghanistan. That's a quite bothersome study. I mean, it's bothersome because it's good. So there is a lot of ability to negotiate. There are splits in the Taliban, as you would expect in any movement like this, about what the end result should be. And so there are a lot of questions, particularly with some of the hardline elements and with the commanders in the field, about how far the Taliban could go in concessions and whether they could enforce those. Nobody knows. At this point, I know a few people who actually talk to Taliban directly. I mean, not negotiators, but outsiders. And my sense is the Taliban has not yet addressed those hard questions within its own ranks, because these are things that could potentially split the organization. As long as they think they can negotiate us out, they don't have to address those questions. So they will only deal with the hard questions in their own ranks and decide about compromises necessary for peace if they believe they can't just negotiate us out. As long as they can just get us to go away, I don't think will even turn inward to decide seriously those questions. Did I do enough of that?
Yeah, that was great. That was really insightful. We've talked a lot about the Taliban. You talked about ISIS. You talked about a whole lot of other factions that are there. We didn't hear you mention a lot of what the role of the warlords are. I mean, we heard a lot of that back in Charlie Wilson's war. We heard a lot of that in the beginning of the Afghan war. Are they in the government, out of the government, working with the Taliban? How do they play, and are they a stabilizing or destabilizing factor?
First part, yes. To all those things. They are in the government. Some of them are in political parties. Some of them are major political candidates. Some of them are in the opposition. Some of them are also still running their own militias and drug networks. A few of them are in jail. They are more active as a counterinsurgency element than as a stabilizing element, although generalizing about them is difficult. For instance, a fellow named Muhammad Atta, who is the governor of Balkh province in the northeast. He's both. He's a former warlord. He's probably corrupt, but he has investments outside of the country. He's brought in industry into Balkh. Power comes down from Tajikistan, so it's one of the better developed has a small industrial base going. Girls' schools have been opened there. He also has a militia. He's supporting one of the presidential candidates. So, you know, to all of those parts of the question, yes. He has all of those things. And you can't really generalize. You can't make him just, if you try to put him in one hole, one pigeonhole, you're not understanding the reality. So you've got to deal with what you've got. And part of it is to reinforce the positive. One of the things I've seen in Afghanistan on warlords is when security goes up, their power goes down. As the Taliban insurgency has gotten worse, their power goes back up because people retreat to where they find security. And so somebody may be a nasty, blood-sucking, corrupt character, but if he's your best chance for life and security, you'll support him. When that breaks down, you don't need him anymore. And so what I saw, for instance, the parliamentary elections in 2005, which was really just before the insurgency really got big again, the power of these guys went way down. And the number of, we massively overestimated the number of deputies we thought that they would win in the parliament, and they didn't. But as the insurgency has gotten worse, I've seen their power regrow.
Excellent. That's really helpful. Let's shift gears a little bit more towards the population changes. You mentioned this last night. So the demographic changes in Afghanistan is, it was a country of, 10 million people in the 60s?
Yeah,
it's now a population of over 35 million.
As much as anybody knows with no census. For
right, right. So you've seen a large increase in population. Typically, a large increase in population needs some commensurate increase in growth in the economy to support that population. We know the economy has been driven by the opium trade. And are we doing anything constructively to counter the opium trade? And are we winning hearts and minds to keep a sustained investment to move them off of opium? And this is a big impact to the United States. We're in the middle of a drug crisis. Do we want to do something more draconian to shut down that trade? So population, economy, opium, drugs.
Population up, although a lot of people are trying to get out. Economy, not good, although there's some interesting features, including the fact that inflation is still not very bad, which is odd for a country that's had this much foreign money come into it, and is really to the credit of the Afghan government. The investment was looking up, it's turned back down. It has potential. There's a lot of stuff. It also has agricultural potential. When we first went there in '67, Afghanistan supplied 40% of the world's raisin market. It totally lost that business, of course. But there are alternatives. Turning to drugs, there is no silver bullet alternative to poppy. And you, frankly, are not going to be able to do anything useful very much about it, is my belief, until or unless you have a measure of security. I wish it were different. There is no more draconian policy that we could usefully use. The only really draconian policy I suppose you could use would be aerial spraying, which President Bush used to favor and I didn't, because I'm convinced that if you did that, you will significantly add to the ranks of the insurgents, because you will, whether or not you can really control the spraying, and that's an argument, you will be blamed for every stillborn child and three-headed goat that is born in the country, and that will turn people against you and move them to the Taliban. When the economy picks up and security picks up, in fact, you see drugs go down. There's a very interesting, when you look at province of Helmand in southern Afghanistan, there was a period during our heavy surge where we had pretty much stabilized the central part of Helmand. And in that period, people moved out of poppy. They found they could make more money by growing multiple vegetable crops. This happens some other places in the country. The roads there were good enough they could move the crops to market. The vegetable crops are not as labor intensive as the opium farming is. So now that you had a measure of security, you saw people buying cars, turning them into taxis, buying motor scooters, and moving back and forth, taking jobs in town, bringing in off-farm income. The whole place was going up with drugs going down. As security went back down, people were afraid to move. Most of that's gone back to hell. At the same time that you had progress in the central area of Helmand, you had people moving into a desert area on the other side of a big irrigation canal. And Afghans are smart, using technology, using deep wells, and using solar power. They have developed several 100,000 acres of land that was desert. The only thing is that poppy is the only crop that makes enough money to pay for the deep well irrigation. So it's all linked. And if I worked hard on eradication. I did it, quite frankly, as much to keep Congress happy and off my back because they wanted to take away other aid money as because I had any real faith that it was going to work. But, I certainly did a piece of that. I just don't think you can do opium reduction in the middle of a war until you get control. There's an interesting parallel. You had opium problems in China when they were still having internal insurgencies. You had them in Thailand. In both those cases, they basically ignored the drugs until they won their insurgencies, and then they limited their drugs. That may be simply a statement of reality rather than of preference.
Excellent.
No, it's a lousy situation.
It's an excellent answer to a lousy situation. You touched on the issue of aid. Does it work? Is the phrase winning hearts and minds real? Does it work? Does contributing substantial amounts of aid, particularly in this situation, contribute to stability or instability? And what do the Afghan people really want us to do now?
This is an area, by the way, where I think we have learned a lot, although a lot of what we've learned is that things don't work the way we think they do. There's an enormous amount of theorizing that went into how we spent aid money, both on the military and the civilian side. The military spent an awful lot of money under the CERT program. We spent a lot on the civilian side on so-called stabilization programs. I think a great many of those, frankly, have not done much. Some of them may, you may stabilize somebody as long as you're hiring them and putting them to work. They won't shoot at you in the daytime. That's of limited value, limited payoff for your money. Some of what we have done has been a major improvement. So there's some things. Infrastructure has basically not been our favorite flavor. We used to do infrastructure, now we do capacity building and institution building. I argued very strongly for roads and power building because without roads you can't move crops to market. You simply can't move out authority. Additionally, with electrical power, Afghanistan's landlocked. It was basically depending on diesel power. If power in Afghanistan, when I was there, cost 6 times as much as it did in Pakistan or Iran. As long as you have that, you can't build even agricultural processing industry. So you grow wheat, you import flour, and you grow tomatoes and you import tomato paste, and you're not creating any jobs for anybody. So I think some of the big infrastructure projects that we've done are very good, very worthwhile, and they create a basis that you can build a lot on. I think a lot of our notions of stabilization, both military and civilian notions, have not proved out very well over time. That's a long subject that I could talk about in a lot of detail, but we don't have time for that. But bottom line is, I think we know much less about stabilization than we thought we did. Now we can start all over again, learning about it. And we should do that because we'll probably do this again somewhere.
Undoubtedly, because we learn.
You know, I mean, people like to say never again as a reason not to learn. But every administration since Harry Truman has had a foreign intervention. And every intervention has had a component that required the civilian and diplomatic peace, and in every one of those we have failed. Actually, it's older than that because when we were making good progress in the conquest of Mexico in 1848, Winfield Scott asked for people from the State Department to help for administration, and we failed at that time too. So there probably are reasons to actually learn the lessons about how to do this better.
Great. So I'm going to give you your penultimate question, because the ultimate one is a softball for you, sort of. You get to pick one, okay? You get to pick one. Answer one of the questions. What about Pakistan? What about Russia? What about China? Pick one.
Well, there's a common element with all three, that if you want to affect their policy, you have to create certitude in their mind about ours. And there are differences in all three, and we could have long discussion, but with all three, talking about what they might do, what they will do, what you want them to do, or how you want to move them, is not going to make much difference unless you can create some sense of belief that they know what we're going to do. Otherwise, because we are a huge player there. And every other country and every other group, including the Taliban, including Afghan politicians, orients their policy to some extent on what they think we will do. Whether they're a friend or an enemy or pursuing completely different kinds of objectives, they have to have an understanding of what they think we're going to do. And if they don't know, they guess. And if they have to guess, since they are dealing with issues of huge national security to them, of transcendental importance, they will worst case it. They will take the worst case guess as the assumption on which they have to build policy. And that will give us an infinity of trouble. And, it's too bad that we're a nation that really doesn't want to be a global leader. We'd be perfectly happy if we could just mind our own business. But we have this position in much of the world. And when we undermine people's confidence in what our policy is, and when we change it, and when we treat it as something that is a day-to-day transactional policy of no long term, then you undermine a lot of institutional relationships that have kept the world secure for the last 70 years. And you make it much more difficult to negotiate anything you want with anybody. I kind of like that question. Thank you.
That was good. That was brilliant, actually. Let's close with your insight. First of all, let me just shorten it. Why did you leave your post in 2007? And let's say by magic wand, President blah 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 appoints you back as ambassador to Afghanistan in 2020. What would you do differently from what you did then? And how
That's your notion of a softball.
That's a softball.
I'm glad you're not asking me hard questions. Why did I leave in 2007? Because I couldn't stay. I tried to stay, actually. I thought it was a bad idea to change out every couple of years, and I volunteered to remain for another year and had it's in another book I wrote, long period of no answer. And finally, I was told, no, Bush administration did not want to, they wanted all three difficult places, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Pakistan, to change in 2007 because they didn't want any of the confirmation hearings for those new ambassadors to take place in 2008 in an election year. I thought if they'd asked me earlier, I'd have probably said I'll take 2 years and solve your problem, but I don't think they ever considered that. In any event, I've asked subsequently, there are a few people who have told me that they thought was also encouraged by overly frank reporting of troubles. I don't actually think that's the case. I can't find any evidence of that. I saw Secretary Rice a few years later, and I asked her up front whether there was anything else. She said, no, that was all it was. So I left because there was, I couldn't stay. Actually, President Karzai, with whom I had fairly decent relations, called up Secretary Rice and asked if they could change that decision and keep me. But I didn't. So that's old history, and it was nice anyway. I was asked if there were things I wanted. I was asked first to come back, and I really, for all the things I didn't have, didn't get done, things I wanted in Afghanistan. This was a period where Iraq was really taking pretty much all our energy. I still had more money and more authority in Afghanistan than I have had in any other place, and probably would have. Afghanistan's one of the few places where I could and did make a decision to halt $10 million for diesel fuel until I got a change policy decision out of peace the Afghan government. Mostly ambassadors don't get to do that. So I thought I don't really want to come back to Washington and write papers to tell other people what to think. I'd rather write telegrams from Kabul to tell them what to think. And I thought you should, this is probably as good as it gets. I've had 3 embassies. I was ambassador in Algeria, and also in a very bloody period, I was ambassador in Bahrain. I've been a deputy assistant secretary. Quit when you're on a roll. And so that's why I left. Would I go back? Maybe. But it wouldn't be a question of redoing. It's a very different situation. Our relations are different. And whether one could, and there are things that in hindsight I wish I'd done differently. Whether I could do a better job if I were to go back in that highly hypothetical question you asked. And as often as I'm critical of this administration, it's not likely to be an immediate problem. But
that's why I said President. Yeah.
Well, by that time I'll probably be too infirm to do it. But it's a very different situation, and what you can work with. Ambassadors can do a great deal to make a policy effective, but they cannot make a bad policy good, and they cannot create certainty in their own government if it does not exist. They can try to fake it pretty well, but there's limits to what you can do. So if one had a policy that I thought worked, I probably would, but it would be a different experience from what I've done.
Excellent. Well, we are very grateful that you're not in Afghanistan right now and that you're in Reno and that you shared some phenomenal insight with us. And I encourage people, when we do the summary, I'll put links to recent podcasts.
Can I have a brief moment for commercial interruption?
Yeah, of course.
I did want to tell you, my day job in the Academy, American Academy of Diplomacy, one of our areas of effort is trying to reach out to Americans, tell them a bit more about what diplomacy is. And I will be seriously criticized when I go home if I don't tell you that we have created 2 podcasts that are out there. You're probably not heavily into the podcast generation, but some of you may be, or some of you may be teaching. There are 2 different ones. One is called American Diplomat, and it's sort of short, very chatty, easy to listen to conversations with different people about all kinds of aspects of diplomacy, working with dictators and consular problems, all kinds. The other series is called The General and the Ambassador. We created it because we thought a lot more Americans understood the idea of the general than they do of the ambassador. And so it's a series of conversations with various commanding generals and the ambassador they worked closely with. So on Iraq, for example, there are actually 3 there. There's one with Petraeus and Crocker. In the early period, there's one with Jim Jeffrey and General Lloyd Austin when he was CENTCOM commander, which is kind of like how we fought Washington and ISIS. And then there's a more recent one with Ambassador Stu Jones and General McFarlane, which is particularly interesting because a lot of this is after the troops went back in to fight ISIS after we re-engaged in Iraq. And it's particularly interesting because I think a lot of Americans have the notion we just sent the troops and they fight. And what you get out of this is how intense the political work was that made it possible for us to have the troops, to how we worked with various militia elements, which elements we couldn't work with, how that had to be brokered with the Iraqi government. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff. They're all on our website, and you'll have a link. And so thank you for giving me a moment for a commercial.
Absolutely, Ron. And thank you for being with us, and thank you all for staying. We appreciate it.